The last normal thing I did was measure a wall, 16 inches of poured concrete, rebar every 8 inches on center, moisture readings within acceptable range. I wrote the numbers on my clipboard in the same handwriting I'd used for 11 years of municipal infrastructure work. Standing in a corridor 60 feet beneath downtown Ridgefield, Oregon. Population 9,000 and change. The corridor smelled like calcium deposits and still water. And the overhead fluorescents, the ones that still worked, gave everything the color of old teeth. My name is Nora Vasquez. I'm a water treatment technician for Clatsop County. Or I was. I'm not sure what the job title is when the county doesn't exist anymore. The bunker was a relic. A Cold War civil defense shelter built in 1962, sealed in 1994, and rediscovered 18 months ago when a water main break exposed its ventilation shaft behind the Ridgefield Community Center. The county hired a structural survey team to assess it for demolition. I was sent down to check for groundwater intrusion and map any connections to the municipal water system, because the original plans were incomplete, and nobody wanted to collapse a forgotten tunnel into an active sewer line. I was alone down there. That was standard for preliminary assessments. One technician, one clipboard, one hard hat with a headlamp. A two-way radio clipped to my belt set to the County Public Works channel. The bunker was a single level as far as the survey indicated. A central corridor approximately 200 feet long with 8 rooms branching off it. A mechanical room housing a defunct air handling system, and a sealed blast door at each end. The east blast door had been forced open by the survey team. The west one was rusted shut. Total square footage, roughly 3,000. A concrete box designed to keep 300 people alive for 2 weeks during a nuclear exchange that never came. I was in the 4th room on the south side, measuring wall thickness with an ultrasonic gauge, when my radio made a sound I'd never heard it make, a continuous tone, high and flat, that overrode the channel and held for a full 10 seconds. Then a voice I recognized as dispatch, a woman named Colleen, who'd been working the public works desk since before I was hired, speaking in a cadence that was wrong, too fast, too precise. She was reading something she'd been handed and didn't believe. All county personnel, shelter in place immediately. Do not travel on surface roads. Lock all exterior doors. This is not a drill. Repeat, all county personnel. The transmission cut, not faded. Cut, mid-syllable, the way a signal ends when the source stops existing. I keyed the radio. Dispatch, this is Vasquez. I'm at the Ridgefield CD site, sub-level. Say again your last, over. Static. I tried 3 more times. I switched channels. Fire, sheriff, EMS, static on every one. Not the crackling, partial static of a weak signal, but the flat, empty static of frequencies with no one on them. I walked back to the east blast door, the one that opened to a set of concrete stairs leading up to a utility basement beneath the community center. The stairs were dark. The temporary work lights the survey team had strung were off, which meant the surface power was out. I turned on my headlamp and climbed. The utility basement door was steel, windowless, and when I pressed my ear against it, I heard something that rearranged the architecture of my nervous system. Not screaming. I could have processed screaming. What I heard was a sound like a crowd moving in a single direction, without coordination, dozens of footfalls at different speeds, and underneath them a vocalization that wasn't speech and wasn't quite moaning. It was lower than that, and wetter. And it came from multiple sources at once, and it didn't stop. I put my hand on the door handle. I didn't turn it. I stood there for what might have been 30 seconds or 5 minutes, listening. And then I heard a single, clear, human sound. A man's voice, close, just on the other side of the door, saying, "No, no, no, no," in a diminishing register that ended in a way I'm not going to describe. I went back down the stairs. I closed the blast door. It weighed approximately 400 pounds and moved on a track system that still functioned despite 3 decades of neglect. and when it seated into its frame, the sound from above vanished so completely that I could hear my own pulse. That was day 1, October 9th. I did what my training told me to do, which was assess my situation using available information and make decisions based on what I could verify rather than what I feared. Verified. I was in a sealed underground structure with 2 exits, one now closed by me and one rusted shut. The structure was concrete, intact, and below grade, meaning whatever was happening on the surface was physically separated from me by several feet of earth and engineered material. The air was stale but breathable. The ventilation shaft I'd identified during my survey connected to the surface near the community center's HVAC system, and passive airflow was occurring even without mechanical assistance. I had my work pack, which contained a flashlight, batteries, a multi-tool, a water bottle, half full, 2 granola bars, and my clipboard. I had my phone, which showed no signal. I had my radio, which raised no one. Unverified. What was happening above me, how far it extended, how long it would last, and whether anyone was coming. I explored the bunker methodically, room by room, the way I'd been doing when Colleen's voice interrupted me. The rooms were largely empty. The original furnishings had been removed during the 1994 decommissioning, leaving bare concrete floors and walls with anchor points where shelving had been. But the mechanical room still held its original equipment, a ventilation fan unit, inoperable, a hand pump well access point that the survey team had noted connected to the same aquifer feeding Ridgefield's water supply, and this saved my life. A wall-mounted emergency supply cabinet that the decommissioning crew had either missed or deliberately left. The cabinet contained 12 gallons of sealed water in military containers dated 1987, 60 cans of civil defense survival crackers with a stated shelf life of indefinite, a first aid kit, 2 wool blankets, a battery-powered AM radio, batteries dead, 4 D-cell batteries, which I tested with my multimeter, 2 viable, and a printed manual titled Shelter Operations Guide. Federal Civil Defense Administration, 60 cans of crackers. Each can held approximately 800 calories of dense, dry, flavorless biscuit designed to sustain a person at subsistence level. 60 cans was roughly 48,000 calories. At a starvation prevention ration of 1,200 calories per day, that was 40 days for one person. The hand pump well was more promising. I primed it for 10 minutes before it caught, and the water that came up was silty but recognizable. I'd tested this aquifer dozens of times at the treatment plant. Clean at the source, drinkable with minimal filtration, and I had the charcoal filter from my work kit. So, 40 days of food, unlimited water, breathable air, and a sealed concrete enclosure between me and whatever had made that sound through the door. I should have felt safe. The math was on my side, at least for now. But there's a difference between safety and the feeling of safety, and that difference lives in the space between what you know and what you can see. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't verify anything. I was a technician in a dead man's shelter with a clipboard and a fading headlamp, and above me, the world was doing something I couldn't name, and no one was coming to explain it. That first night, if you can call it night when you're 60 feet underground with no clock except your phone's dying battery, I sat in the mechanical room with my back against the well pump, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled like 1962, and ate half a can of survival crackers. They tasted like compressed chalk with a faint memory of wheat. I ate them slowly, deliberately, not because I was rationing, but because the act of eating required my hands and my jaw to do something purposeful, and purpose was the only thing standing between me and the sound I'd heard through that door. I started a tally on the wall with a carpenter's pencil from my kit. 1 mark. Day 1. The first week was a negotiation with silence, not metaphorical silence, actual, physical, architectural silence. The bunker was so far below grade and so thoroughly sealed that the ambient noise level was effectively 0. No traffic, no wind, No plumbing sounds. No electrical hum. When I sat still and held my breath, I could hear the fluid in my own inner ear. That's not something a human is designed to experience. We're built for a world with a background. Wind, insects, the distant murmur of other people existing. Remove that background, and the brain begins to improvise. By day 3, I was hearing things that weren't there. A rhythmic tapping that turned out to be my own heartbeat, amplified through the concrete floor. A low hum vanished when I stood up. Voices that dissolved the moment I focused on them. I built a routine because routine is the scaffolding of sanity. Wake at what my phone's clock, still running, even without signal, told me was 6 a.m. Pump water, filter water, eat 1/3 of a cracker can, walk the corridor, all 200 feet of it, 10 times. That was approximately half a mile. Check the east blast door. Press my ear against it. Listen for 60 seconds. Report findings to myself. Check the west blast doors. Same protocol. Though this one never produced anything but the dead sound of rusted steel against a concrete frame. Return to the mechanical room. Eat another 1/3 of a cracker can. Pump more water. Read the Shelter Operations Guide, which was written in the earnest, paternalistic prose of the early 1960s, and contained surprisingly useful information about sanitation, morale, and the psychological management of confined groups. Walk the corridor again. Eat the final 1/3. Mark the wall. Sleep. On day 4, I got the AM radio working. The 2 viable batteries gave it power. And after cycling through frequencies of static, I found a signal. Weak, distant, clearly not local. A man's voice, professional, broadcasting on what I later understood was an emergency relay network, confirmed in all major metropolitan areas west of the Rockies. Portland and Seattle are under full quarantine. Military assets have been redeployed to defensive cordons along Interstate 84 and Highway 12. Civilian population is advised to remain indoors, avoid contact with any individual exhibiting aggressive or unresponsive behavior, and await further instruction. The cause remains under investigation. Transmission repeats in 15 minutes. I listened to it repeat 4 times, writing down every word on the back of my clipboard sheets. The broadcast gave me a framework for what I'd heard through the door. Something was happening to people. Something that made them aggressive, unresponsive. Something that moved through population centers with a speed that overwhelmed military response. The broadcast didn't use the word I was already thinking. Nobody on the radio ever did. Not in those early transmissions. They said affected individuals. They said compromised. They said hostile contacts. I knew what I'd heard through that door. The sound a person makes when they're being consumed by something that used to be another person. Whatever vocabulary the broadcasts were avoiding, my body had already classified the threat, and my body was not going to be talked out of it by euphemisms. The batteries lasted 6 days. I used the radio sparingly. 15 minutes in the morning, 15 at night. And each broadcast added to my understanding the way sediment builds a riverbed. Slowly, incrementally, each layer slightly darker than the last. Portland had fallen in the first 72 hours. The military cordons were contracting. The term reanimation appeared on day 5's broadcast, clinical and devastating, dropped into the middle of a sentence like a stone into still water. When the batteries died on day 9, I was alone with silence again. But now, the silence contained information. I knew what was above me. I knew it wasn't stopping. And I knew that my 40 days of food was not a buffer. It was a countdown. Day 14. I'd lost 3 pounds that I estimated by the looseness of my belt. And I'd developed a persistent headache that lived behind my right eye and pulsed in time with my heartbeat. The survival crackers were calorie-dense but nutritionally narrow. And my body was beginning to send specific complaints. Joint stiffness from the cold concrete, muscle fatigue from insufficient protein, a persistent metallic taste that I attributed to the mineral content of the aquifer water. I was functioning. I was not thriving. There's a medical distinction between those two states. And living inside that distinction for 2 weeks teaches you that the body is a system with tolerances. And every system operating at its tolerances is one perturbation from failure. I'd read the Shelter Operations Guide cover to cover 3 times. The section on psychological management was written for shelter managers overseeing groups, but I adapted its principles for an audience of 1. Maintain structure. Assign tasks. Monitor for signs of deterioration. Withdrawal, repetitive behavior, fixation, distorted time perception. The irony of self-monitoring for psychological deterioration is that the monitor and the subject are the same instrument, and a miscalibrated instrument doesn't know it's miscalibrated. But I tried. I kept my notes. I talked to myself, out loud, deliberately, using my own name, because the guide said that verbal self-address helped maintain ego coherence in isolation. And I chose to believe a pamphlet written by Cold War psychologists because the alternative was to trust my own unverified judgment. Nora, it's day 14. You have 26 days of food remaining. Your water supply is stable. Your air quality is adequate. Your physical condition is diminished but functional. Your mental state is... I stopped. Because how do you finish that sentence honestly when you're standing in an underground corridor talking to yourself by the light of a headlamp that's on its second set of batteries? Your mental state is present, I said, and moved on. I'd begun mapping the bunker in detail, not because I needed to. I'd memorized the layout by day 3, but because the act of measuring and drawing occupied the part of my brain that would otherwise be listening for sounds through the blast door. My clipboard sheets became architectural drawings, precise floor plans, wall sections, structural details. I noted every crack, every water stain, every anchor point. I noted the places where the concrete had spalled and the rebar was visible, and I calculated load tolerances from the exposed cross-sections. This was my training asserting itself, my professional identity insisting on its relevance in a context where it should have been meaningless. But it wasn't meaningless. It kept me in my own mind. It kept me recognizing myself. On day 15, I found the hatch. Room 6, south side. The one I'd been using as a latrine because it was farthest from the mechanical room where I slept. I'd been in this room dozens of times. But on day 15, while measuring the floor for drainage slope, my ultrasonic gauge returned a reading that didn't match the others. The floor thickness in one section was 4 inches instead of the standard 8. I got on my hands and knees with my headlamp and found the seam. A rectangular cut in the concrete, approximately 3 feet by 3 feet, filled with a poured patch that was visually identical to the surrounding floor, but structurally different, newer, thinner, deliberately concealed. I spent 2 hours working the patch loose with my multi-tool. Beneath it was a steel hatch with a recessed handle, heavily corroded, but intact. The hatch was not on any survey document I'd been given. It was not in the original plans. It was not in the Shelter Operations Guide. I pulled the handle. The hatch resisted, then gave with a sound like a sealed jar opening, and a current of air rose from below. Cooler than the bunker air, with a chemical tinge I couldn't immediately identify. Below the hatch was a steel ladder descending into darkness. I should have closed it. The rational assessment was clear. Unknown space, unknown conditions, unknown risk. And I was alone with no way to communicate or call for help. But rationality operates on a budget, and 14 days of isolation had spent most of mine. What I had left was curiosity, which is just the survival instinct wearing a different face. The need to know what's in the dark, because not knowing is its own kind of danger. I climbed down. The lower level was not on any plan, because the lower level was not supposed to exist. The ladder descended 12 feet into a space that was immediately, obviously different from the bunker above. Same concrete construction, same Cold War engineering, but expanded. Where the upper level was a single corridor with branching rooms, this was a network A central chamber roughly 30 feet square with 3 corridors radiating outward, each terminating in rooms I couldn't see from the base of the ladder. The ceiling was lower, maybe 7 feet, and the walls showed evidence of modification. Newer concrete patches, conduit runs that post-dated the original construction, and, most significantly, lighting. Fluorescent fixtures, wired to a junction box that was clearly installed decades after the original build. The fixtures were off, but they were there, which meant someone had brought power down here at some point. The chemical smell was stronger. I recognized it now. A stabilized fuel, like kerosene but cleaner, and beneath it, something organic. Not decay, more like the concentrated smell of a space that had been lived in. Sweat, cooking, the accumulated olfactory residue of human habitation. I followed the first corridor with my headlamp cutting a narrow cone through the dark. The corridor was 50 feet long and ended in a room that stopped me in the doorway. Supplies, not the sparse, forgotten emergency cabinet of the upper level. Organized, deliberate, extensive stores. Metal shelving units lined 3 walls, stacked with canned food, bottled water, medical supplies, fuel canisters, batteries, tools, clothing. I saw bags of rice in sealed containers. I saw powdered milk. I saw canned vegetables and fruit with labels from multiple decades, some from the 1990s, some clearly recent, purchased within the last few years. Someone had been stocking this place, continuously, over a long period of time. The second corridor led to a living space. 4 cots with actual mattresses, a folding table, chairs, a small library of books on a shelf, a portable camp stove connected to a propane tank, a 5-gallon bucket latrine with chemical treatment supplies. The third corridor was where I found them. I smelled them before I saw them. Not the smell of the infected, which I'd cataloged through the upper blast door, but the smell of living humans who hadn't bathed adequately in a long time. Then my headlamp caught eyes. 4 pairs, reflecting the light the way human eyes do, and 4 bodies pressing back against the far wall of a room that had been furnished as some kind of command center. Maps on the walls, a desk with a ham radio setup, notebooks, pencils. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We just stared at each other across 12 feet of cold air. And I could see in their faces the same calculation I was running in mine. Threat or salvation. The oldest of them broke the silence. A man in his 60s, white-bearded, wearing a flannel shirt that had been worn so many days it had molded to his posture. His voice was hoarse from disuse. "How did you get in?" "Through the hatch. Upstairs. Room 6. That hatch was sealed. It was patched. I broke the patch." He processed this. Then, "Are you bitten? Scratched? Any contact at all?" "No. I've been alone upstairs since October 9th. "Upstairs," he repeated, and something in his expression shifted. Not relief, exactly, but a recalibration. He looked at the others. A woman in her 40s holding a hand-crank flashlight. A younger man in a county maintenance uniform I recognized. And a teenage girl sitting on the floor with her knees drawn up and her eyes fixed on me, with an intensity that had nothing to do with fear. "My name is Warren Greeley," the older man said. "This is my shelter. You're in my shelter. And I need you to understand something before we go any further." He paused. "We are not leaving. Any of you. Not until it's safe. And I decide when it's safe." Warren Greeley was a retired systems engineer who had worked for a defense contractor in the 1980s and 1990s, and he had spent the last 23 years quietly, methodically, and in complete secrecy, expanding the forgotten civil defense bunker beneath Ridgefield into a survival installation. He'd discovered the bunker the same way the county eventually would, through infrastructure work, in his case a sewer line repair he'd supervised in 2001. But where the county saw a demolition candidate, Warren saw a foundation. He'd built the lower level himself, over years, working alone or with occasional hired help he told was doing basement renovation. He'd stockpiled supplies the way other people contribute to retirement accounts. Steadily, consistently, with a timeline measured in decades. He told me this over the first hour, sitting at the folding table in the living quarters, speaking with the controlled cadence of someone who had rehearsed this explanation many times in his head and was finally delivering it to an audience. The others listened with the glazed patience of people who had heard it before. The woman was Martine Okafor, a librarian from Ridgefield's public library. She'd been in the community center when it started, attending a municipal budget meeting in the same building whose basement connected to the upper bunker. She'd found the bunker entrance while fleeing the building and had descended, alone, in the dark, following the same stairs I'd used. That was day one. Warren had heard her moving above him on the upper level and had opened the hatch from below, assessed her, and brought her down. The younger man was Cal Phelan, the county maintenance worker whose uniform I'd recognized. He'd been doing electrical work in the community center's utility basement and had the same experience I did: the radio alert, the sounds, the retreat underground. Warren collected him on day 2. The teenage girl was Birdie, just Birdie. She was 16 or 17. She wouldn't specify. And she had arrived on day 4 through means she didn't explain, and Warren didn't press. She'd been in the upper bunker when Warren found her, sitting in the dark against the east blast door, not making a sound. She hadn't spoken for the first 3 days underground. Now she spoke sparingly, in short sentences, with a precision that suggested she was choosing each word from a very limited budget. 4 people, plus me, in a hidden concrete installation with enough food. I'd count later. For 5 people for approximately 120 days. Water from the same aquifer I'd been tapping upstairs. A ventilation system Warren had rigged using PVC pipe, and a solar-powered fan unit vented through a disguised surface opening on the hillside behind the community center. A ham radio that Warren operated twice daily, monitoring frequencies, never broadcasting. Never. Sound attracts them. Radio signals might. I don't know the mechanism. I'm not taking the risk. People could be looking for survivors, rescue operations, military. The military pulled back to the Cascades on day 3, Warren said. I heard it happen in real time. They're not coming to Ridgefield. No one is coming to Ridgefield. The only thing above us is them. And the only thing keeping us alive is that they don't know we're here. I looked at Martine, who met my eyes with an expression that communicated complex information. She disagreed with Warren. She had argued with Warren. And she had lost. I looked at Cal, who was cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife and not making eye contact with anyone. I looked at Birdie, who was watching me with that same fixed intensity. And I realized what it was. Not fear, not hostility. Recognition. She was recognizing in me the same thing I was recognizing in her. The particular quality of a person who had been alone with silence long enough to know what it costs, and who was performing a rapid, desperate assessment of whether these other people were going to make the cost higher or lower. How long? I asked Warren. How long what? Do you plan to stay down here? He smiled, not warmly, with the satisfaction of a man whose preparation has been validated by catastrophe. As long as it takes. That's the whole point. That's what this was built for. We wait. We endure. We outlast. I looked at my hands. They were shaking. Not from fear. From the sudden, disorienting recalibration of my situation. I'd gone from 40 days alone to 120 days with 4 strangers. And the strangers were led by a man who had spent 2 decades building a box and had no intention of ever opening it. The days reorganized themselves around Warren's architecture. He had a system for everything, a posted schedule on the wall of the central chamber, handwritten in block letters, allocating time for meals, maintenance, sleep, exercise, walking laps of the corridors in prescribed rotations to avoid congestion, radio monitoring, Warren only, and what he called personal time, which was a 2-hour afternoon block during which each person retreated to their designated space and did whatever they did with silence. I was assigned the 5th cot, moved from storage into the living quarters, positioned between Martine's and the wall. The quarters were tight with 5 people. You could hear everyone breathe, shift, swallow. Privacy was a concept that the architecture had eliminated, and its absence created a specific kind of psychological friction. Not conflict, not yet, but the constant, low-grade awareness of being perceived. Every facial expression was witnessed. Every sigh was interpreted. You could not have a feeling without it becoming a communal event. Martine was the first person I connected with, because Martine was the first person who acknowledged that the situation was not sustainable. She said it plainly on my 3rd day in the lower level, while we were pumping water together at the handwell access point. Warren is brilliant, and Warren is prepared, and Warren is also constructing a reality in which staying underground forever is rational. It's not. It's a bunker, not a civilization. The food is finite, the fuel is finite, and we are finite. Not our bodies, our minds. I can feel mine changing, Nora. I've been down here 20 days, and I can feel the shape of my thinking narrowing. What do you want to do? I want information, real information, not Warren's curated radio fragments. I want to know what's above us. I want to open that blast door and look. Warren won't allow it. Warren doesn't get to allow things. He's not a government. He's a man with a bunker. But that was the problem. And Martine knew it, even as she said it. Warren controlled the supplies, the radio, the knowledge of the lower-level systems. He'd built this place over 23 years, and he knew every conduit, every valve, every structural tolerance. Without his expertise, the bunker was just a concrete box. With it, the box functioned. And functioning was the difference between survival and burial. Cal stayed neutral in the way that some people stay neutral, not from conviction, but from exhaustion. He'd been a maintenance worker for the county for 6 years, a quiet man in his early 30s who fixed things that broke and didn't ask larger questions about the systems those things belonged to. Underground, he applied the same approach. He maintained the equipment Warren assigned him, ate the rations Warren distributed, slept when the schedule said to sleep, and when Martine raised objections in the evening discussions that Warren had established as a pressure valve, Cal sat quietly and aligned with whoever spoke last. Bertie was something else entirely. She didn't participate in the discussions. She didn't align with anyone. She occupied her cot, her corner, her silence, with a self-containment that I initially mistook for trauma and gradually came to understand as something more deliberate. Bertie was watching. She was cataloging. She was constructing her own model of the situation independent of Warren's narrative, and she was doing it without giving anyone data about her conclusions. On day 25, my 11th day in the lower level, she approached me during personal time and said the most words I'd heard from her in sequence. He's wrong about the radio. I've been counting his monitoring times. He listens for 30 minutes twice a day. That's 1 hour out of 24. He's missing 96% of transmissions. If there's a rescue signal, we wouldn't know. Have you told him? He doesn't listen to me. He listens to himself. You're new. He might still listen to you. She was right about Warren and wrong about me. When I raised the radio monitoring schedule that evening, framing it as a resource optimization question, the language of systems engineering, his language, Warren listened politely, and then explained that extended radio monitoring drained the batteries, which were finite, and that the probability of a rescue signal was low enough to not justify the expenditure. What probability? I asked. Based on what data? Based on what I've heard. Based on the pattern of the broadcasts. The military is gone, Nora. The government is gone. The signals that remain are survivor fragments. Disconnected, local, fading. There is no rescue coming. The sooner you accept that, the better you'll manage. He said it gently. That was the thing about Warren. He was never cruel, never authoritarian in tone. He spoke like a patient engineer explaining tolerances to a junior technician, and the gentleness was what made it so difficult to resist, because resistance felt like ingratitude. He'd built this. He'd prepared this. We were alive because of his foresight, and every challenge to his authority carried the implicit counterfactual. Where would you be without me? In the upper bunker alone, with 40 days of crackers and a fading headlamp. I knew the answer. He knew I knew. Day 32. I lost track of my own name. Not literally. I could state it if asked. But in the middle of a corridor walk, alone, counting laps, I reached for the internal sense of who I was and found it thinner than it should have been. Not gone, but translucent. The way a word loses meaning if you repeat it too many times. Nora, Nora, Nora. Sound is just a sound. And the person it refers to is an abstraction. The Shelter Operations Guide had warned about this. Extended isolation may produce depersonalization, derealization, and identity diffusion. I'd read those words on day 6 and filed them as clinical terminology. On day 32, I understood they were a description of a lived experience, as precise as any measurement I'd ever taken with an instrument. My sense of self had a reading, and the reading was dropping. I started anchoring. That's what I called it. Every morning, before Warren's schedule began, I sat on my cot and recited facts about myself, my full name, my parents' names, my address. Meaningless now, but structurally relevant. The names of my co-workers at the treatment plant. The feel of sunlight on my hands when I walked from the parking lot to the building. The taste of the terrible coffee in the break room. Specific memories, specific sensations, anything that connected Nora Vasquez, the underground survivor, to Nora Vasquez, the person who had existed in the world above. Martine noticed. She didn't ask. She just started doing something similar, murmuring to herself during personal time. And one afternoon she caught my eye and said, "I'm losing the color of my daughter's kitchen. I can remember the layout. I can't remember if the walls were yellow or cream." Her daughter lived in Eugene. Martine had no information about her status. This absence had been, for the first 3 weeks, a wound she pressed on daily, monitoring for changes. By day 32, she'd stopped pressing. Not because it hurt less, but because the wound had become part of the architecture of her pain. Load-bearing, structural, impossible to remove without collapsing something essential. Cal was the first one who cracked visibly. On day 35, he stopped getting up when the schedule said to wake. He lay on his cot facing the wall and didn't respond to Warren's prompt. And when I touched his shoulder, he flinched so violently that I stepped back. California. I'm not doing it today. Not doing what? Any of it. The schedule, the laps, the pretending that this is a life. Warren appeared in the doorway. I expected him to command, to insist. Instead, he looked at Cal with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before. Recognition, not of Cal's specific pain, but of the phenomenon. He'd read about this, planned for it, perhaps even experienced something like it during his decades of solitary preparation. "Take the day," Warren said quietly. "Tomorrow you get up." Cal took the day, and the next day he got up. But something in him had shifted. A load-bearing wall had cracked, and while the structure still stood, the tolerances had changed. He began to talk during meals in a way he hadn't before. Not about strategy or logistics, but about the past. His mother's garden in Klatskanee. The sound of the Columbia River from the dock where he fished on Sundays. A woman named Dana he'd been seeing for 4 months and hadn't called before the radio went silent because he thought there'd be time. Birdie listened to these monologues with the only expression I ever saw her wear that resembled tenderness. She never offered her own memories in exchange. But she listened. And once, when Cal faltered mid-sentence because the weight of what he was remembering became temporarily unbearable, Birdie said, "The dock. Tell me about the dock." And he did. And the telling brought him back from wherever he'd been going. I marked day 35 on the wall. 35 marks, each one a scratch in concrete that proved a day had existed, that time was passing even in a place that felt engineered to deny it. 40 days left on Warren's ration schedule before we'd need to recalculate. 65 days left on mine, the count I kept privately, based on my own assessment of the supplies, rather than Warren's numbers. His numbers were more conservative than the stores warranted. I'd noticed the discrepancy and hadn't said anything yet, because I was still deciding what it meant, whether Warren was being cautious, or whether he was shaping our perception of scarcity to maintain control. Both, I would eventually conclude. Both at once. And the distance between caution and control so narrow that the man standing on it might not know which side he was facing. Day 48 brought the sound. I was at the hand pump, filling the daily water containers, when I felt it before I heard it. A vibration in the pump handle, transmitted through the steel and into my hands. A rhythmic thudding, felt more than heard, coming from above, not the random, wandering movement I'd learned to associate with the infected through the upper blast door. This was structured, deliberate, the unmistakable cadence of someone knocking. I stopped pumping. The vibration continued. I traced it, not from the blast door, not from the hatch to the upper level, but from a section of ceiling in the central chamber that corresponded, by my mapping, to the area beneath the community center's main floor. Someone was above us, someone alive, knocking on the floor. Warren was at the radio desk when I told him. He stopped mid-sentence. He'd been logging a frequency, and tilted his head to listen. The vibration was faint but present, filtering through 60 feet of earth and concrete with just enough force to register. "How long?" he asked. 3 minutes. It hasn't stopped. He stood and walked to the central chamber and placed his palm flat against the ceiling. I watched his face perform the same calculation I'd already completed. Human, deliberate, alive. "Could be a trap," he said. "Infected don't knock. We don't know what they do. We don't know what they've become. It's been 48 days. Behavior could have changed. Warren, that's a person." He lowered his hand. The knocking continued for another 10 minutes and then stopped, and the silence that followed was heavier than the silence that preceded it, because now the silence contained someone we'd chosen not to answer. Martine was furious, not loud. Martine didn't do loud, but her anger had a density that filled the living quarters like pressure. Someone is alive up there. Someone found the community center and they're looking for help, and we're sitting 60 feet below them pretending we can't hear. "We're protecting what we have," Warren said. "What we have is a hole in the ground that we're too afraid to justify. What we have is alive. All 5 of us, alive, because I built this, and because I've maintained the discipline that keeps it functioning. Every person we add changes the math. Stop saying math. People aren't math. In a closed system, they are. Every additional body reduces our timeline. Every open door is a risk we can't reverse. If that person is injured, they consume medical supplies. If they're incubating infection, they end everything. Everything, Martine. And if they're alone and scared and dying because we were too careful, what does that cost?" Warren didn't answer. He returned to the radio desk. The conversation was over, decided by his silence, which functioned as a veto because the architecture was his, and the supplies were his, and the knowledge that kept the air flowing was his. That night, Bertie sat next to me against the corridor wall during personal time and said, "There's a vent access in corridor 2. It connects to a utility chase that runs up to the community center's crawl space. Warren sealed it with a plate and 4 bolts. I've had my hand on those bolts every day for a week. Why are you telling me? Because tomorrow I'm removing them. And I want someone to know in case something goes wrong. Bertie, I'm not asking permission. I'm making a notification." I looked at her, 16 or 17, thin, her hair unwashed and pulled back with a rubber band she'd found in the supply room, her eyes carrying the particular clarity of someone who has made a decision and is no longer negotiating with it. I recognized that clarity. I'd seen it in the mirror on day 1 when I closed the blast door. "I'll go with you," I said. We went at 2 a.m., during what the schedule designated as sleep period. Warren slept deeply. One of the few advantages of his absolute confidence in his own systems was that he rested within them without anxiety. Cal slept like he did everything, compliantly, on schedule. Martine was awake. I could tell by her breathing. But she didn't move. Birdie had the bolts out in 4 minutes. She'd been practicing, I realized, turning them incrementally each day during personal time, loosening them in quarter rotations so gradual they made no sound. The plate came away to reveal a vertical utility chase, 18 inches square, lined with the original galvanized ductwork. Too small for an adult. Not too small for Birdie. "I'll go up, see what's there, come back," she whispered. 10 minutes. "If something goes wrong, then you put the plate back." She climbed into the chase with a competence that told me this wasn't her first time navigating tight spaces, and I filed that information alongside everything else Birdie had never explained about herself. I heard her ascending. The soft scrape of shoes on metal, the controlled breathing of someone who understood how to move quietly. And then silence. 4 minutes. 6. 8. At 9 minutes, I heard her descending. She emerged from the chase with concrete dust in her hair and something new in her expression. Not fear, not excitement. Grief. "There's a man," she said, "in the community center basement, the utility room. He's barricaded in with furniture. He's alive. He's been hitting the floor with a pipe. Condition: not bitten, not injured that I could see. Dehydrated. Maybe 50 years old. He begged me not to leave." The grief in her face was the grief of having been begged by a stranger and knowing that the answer depended on people other than herself. She'd have brought him down without hesitation. I understood that about her now. Understood it as a fundamental structural fact. Birdie's moral threshold was not a line she'd calculated. It was a reflex, as involuntary as blinking. "Did you tell him about us?" "I told him there were people below. I told him I'd come back." "Birdie, I know. Warren will refuse. That's why I need you to help me bring him down before Warren wakes up." I stood in that corridor at 2:15 in the morning, 60 feet underground, holding a metal plate in my hands, and I felt the architecture of my situation rearrange itself. Warren's authority was not arbitrary. It was earned, built, load-bearing. His caution had kept 5 people alive for 48 days. Overriding him was not a small act. It was a structural modification to the social system that sustained us, and I was a technician who understood that structural modifications have consequences. But there was a man upstairs hitting a pipe against a floor because he could hear us, and we could save him. And the math that said we shouldn't was the same math that said I should have stayed in the upper bunker alone with my 40 days of crackers. I put the plate down. Birdie and I climbed the chase together. She went first, guiding me through the tight sections where the ductwork narrowed, and we emerged in a crawl space thick with dust and the sound of scratching. Not from the infected, from the man on the other side of the crawl space hatch, who had heard us moving and was scratching at the panel with his fingernails. His name was Gene Massey. He was a postal carrier. He'd been delivering mail on October 9th and had run when the first wave hit downtown Ridgefield, taking shelter in the community center because it was the nearest public building with heavy doors. He'd survived on vending machine food and bathroom tap water for the first 30 days. Then the infected had entered the building through a window he couldn't reach, and he'd retreated to the utility basement, barricading himself in with filing cabinets and broken chairs. He'd heard vibrations below him, our footsteps, our voices transmitted through the concrete, and had spent the last 18 days hitting the floor with a pipe wrench, waiting. 18 days. We brought him down through the chase. It was harder for him. He was larger than me, malnourished, shaking with the physical and emotional expenditure of 18 days of solitary terror. But he made it. He dropped into the corridor of the lower level and stood there, swaying, looking at the lights and the walls and the supplies with the expression of a man who has been pulled from water and is still feeling the current. Warren was standing in the corridor when we turned around, arms crossed, face unreadable. "This is Gene," Bertie said. He's staying. Warren didn't shout. Warren didn't threaten. Warren did something more effective, he recalculated. He sat at the folding table with his notebooks and his inventory logs, and spent 3 hours revising the supply timeline. And when he was finished, he presented the results to the group with the neutral precision of an engineer delivering a structural assessment. 6 people. Current supplies. 93 days remaining from today's date. That's day 141 total. We will begin to run out of critical supplies, medical, fuel for the stove, water treatment chemicals. Around day 120. Food will hold longer because we can reduce caloric intake. But reduced caloric intake produces physical and cognitive decline that compromises our ability to maintain systems. The margin is now negative. We are operating past our design capacity. He looked at Jean, who was sitting on a folded blanket on the floor because there was no 6th cot, eating rice from a metal cup with the focused intensity of a man for whom eating is not yet routine again. I'm not asking you to leave, Warren said. You're here. That's done. But everyone needs to. He sat at the folding table with his notebooks and his inventory logs, and spent 3 hours revising the supply timeline. And when he was finished, he presented the results to the group with the neutral precision of an engineer delivering a structural assessment. 6 people. Current supplies. 93 days remaining from today's date. That's day 141 total. We will begin to run out of critical supplies, medical, fuel for the stove, water treatment chemicals. Around day 120. Food will hold longer because we can reduce caloric intake. But reduced caloric intake produces physical and cognitive decline that compromises our ability to maintain systems. The margin is now negative. We are operating past our design capacity. He looked at Jean, who was sitting on a folded blanket on the floor because there was no 6th cot, eating rice from a metal cup with the focused intensity of a man for whom eating is not yet routine again. I'm not asking you to leave, Warren said. You're here. That's done. But everyone needs to understand what here now means. It means less. For longer. With more risk. Jean looked up. His face was gaunt, his postal service jacket hanging off him like a scarecrow's costume. I'll eat half rations. I'll do whatever work needs doing. I spent 18 days alone, hitting a pipe against a floor. I'll do anything to not go back to that. Warren nodded. Not warmly. With the acceptance of a man incorporating an unplanned variable into his model. The group shifted after Jean. Not immediately, not dramatically, but the way a building shifts when a new load is added. Subtle redistributions of stress that you can measure if you know where to look. Warren's authority didn't collapse, but it thinned. Jean's presence was proof that the world above still contained living people. That the bunker was not the last outpost of humanity, but a node in a network of survival that we were choosing not to connect to. That knowledge changed the atmospheric pressure in the lower level. It made the ceiling feel lower and the walls feel closer. Because for the first time, we were underground, not because we had to be, but because Warren had decided we should be. Martine began openly advocating for a surface reconnaissance, not evacuation, just information. Open the east blast door, ascend the stairs, look. See what day looked like above ground. See if the infected were still concentrated in town or had dispersed. See if the military cordons Warren had dismissed had reformed. If the radio silence was a communication failure rather than a civilizational one. Cal, to everyone's surprise, supported her. His voice was quiet when he spoke at the evening discussion, but it carried weight because Cal never spoke at evening discussions. I can't stay down here until day 141, he said. I know that sounds like weakness. Maybe it is. But I'm telling you what I know about myself. I will not be a person anymore by day 141. I'll be something that used to be a person, and I don't want to survive as that. Bertie said nothing during these discussions. She'd already demonstrated her position by climbing a utility shaft and bringing Jean into the group over Warren's implicit objection. She didn't need to argue. She'd acted. Arguments were for people who were still deciding. I was still deciding. That's what I kept telling myself. But the truth, which I turned over and over during the long, quiet hours, was that I'd already decided on day one. When I closed the blast door and descended into the dark, I decided that I would do whatever was necessary to stay alive. The question was whether alive meant the same thing at day 50 that it had meant at day 1. Because at day 1, alive meant a heartbeat. At day 50, alive meant something more expensive. It meant being someone I could recognize, someone whose name meant more than a sound, someone who hadn't traded every human connection for another day of breathing in a concrete room. Warren felt the shift. I could see it in the way he tightened the schedule, reduced personal time, increased his monitoring of the supply inventory, not tyrannically, efficiently. The efficiency of a system engineer who senses that his system is developing failure modes he didn't model for. On day 55, he found the bolts missing from the vent plate and replaced them with welds. Day 61. Gene changed the equation. He'd been monitoring the radio during Warren's off hours. Not secretly exactly, but during his designated personal time, with the volume low enough that Warren couldn't hear from his cot. Gene had been a ham radio hobbyist before the outbreak, and his ear for frequencies was better than Warren's. On day 61, at 3 a.m., he caught a signal Warren had never found. He woke me with a hand on my shoulder and a whisper, "Nora, come listen." The signal was military, not the broad emergency broadcasts that had faded weeks ago, but a specific tactical frequency, a logistics channel used for coordination between units. The voice was male, professional, speaking in partial jargon that Gene translated in real time. Forward operating base, Longview. They're talking about a FOB in Longview, Washington. 30 resupply convoy, Route 30 West. They're running convoys on Route 30. Route 30 ran along the Columbia River. It passed within 8 miles of Ridgefield. Civilian intake. They said intake. They're taking people in. I sat in the dark, listening to a military radio operator discuss convoy schedules and intake protocols, and I felt something I hadn't felt since day 1. A future tense. Not survival as endurance, but survival as transition, as movement from one state to another, from underground to surface, from stasis to trajectory. "We need to tell Warren," I said. "Warren will say it could be old, could be on loop, could be compromised." "Could it?" "No. The frequencies rotate on a schedule I can hear them referencing. This is live, current, and ongoing. There's a base in Longview and they're accepting civilians." I told Martine first, then Cal, then Birdie, who simply said, "When do we go?" Warren's reaction was exactly what Gene predicted, delivered with exactly the patience and reasonableness that made it so difficult to counter. The signal could be misinterpreted. The base could be overrun by the time we reached it. The route was 30 miles through territory we hadn't seen in 2 months. The risk was incalculable. "The risk of staying is calculable," I said. "You calculated it yourself. Day 141. That's 80 days from now. And then we're out of supplies in a hole with no options. If we go now, we have strength. We have daylight hours. We have a destination. And if the destination doesn't exist, then we know. And knowing is better than waiting for math we can't change." The vote wasn't formal. Warren didn't believe in votes. He believed in analysis, in engineering judgment, in the authority of the person who built the system. But this wasn't his system anymore. It was ours. 5 voices to his 1, and while we owed him our lives, we also owed ourselves the chance to live them above ground. Warren voted no. Everyone else voted yes. And Warren, to his credit, to the part of him that was a decent man beneath the engineer, beneath the architect of controlled isolation, didn't try to stop us. "I'm staying," he said. "This is my shelter. I built it. I'll die in it if that's what it takes. But I won't leave it." Martine sat with him for an hour after the decision. I don't know what they said. When she emerged, her eyes were red, but her posture was resolved. "He means it," she said. "He's not coming." Day 64. We left. 3 days of preparation. Jean mapped the route using Warren's topographical charts, north through the forested hills behind Ridgefield, avoiding the town center, connecting to rural roads that paralleled Route 30 toward Longview. 30 miles of terrain that none of us had seen since early October, through an environment whose threat density was entirely unknown. Warren, despite his refusal to leave, helped with the preparation. He distributed supplies with the meticulous fairness of a man whose principles outlasted his preferences. Food for 10 days per person. Water bottles, medical basics, a flashlight each, a hand-crank radio for Jean. He gave Cal a hatchet from the tool stores. He gave me a detailed log of every radio transmission he'd recorded over 64 days, organized chronologically, annotated with his analysis. "In case whoever's in Longview wants to know what happened here," he said. "Someone should document it." The east blast door hadn't been opened since I closed it on day 1. Warren operated the mechanism, a hand-crank wheel that retracted the locking bolts, and the door swung open on hinges that screamed with corrosion. Behind it, the concrete stairs ascended into darkness. The air that came down was different from our recycled atmosphere. Cold, organic, carrying the smells of the world above. Rain, earth, decomposition. We climbed single file, Jean first, then Cal with the hatchet, then Martine, then me, then Birdie. The utility basement was dark, the power long dead. My headlamp, same headlamp, but of batteries, cut through the blackness and showed me the space I'd last seen 64 days ago. It looked the same. Concrete, steel door, the world's most mundane threshold. I pressed my ear against the door the way I had on day 1. This time, nothing. No movement, no vocalization, no sound of any kind. Just the silence of an empty building in an empty town on a gray October. No, November, December. I'd lost the months. It was December now, early December. And the world had been running without us for 2 months, and the silence on the other side of this door could mean anything. I opened it. The community center lobby was destroyed, not by the infected, by time, by weather entering through broken windows, by the absence of maintenance. Water damage on the ceiling, leaves on the floor, a smell of mildew and cold air. Through the shattered front windows, I could see the parking lot, empty, and beyond it the street, and beyond the street, the tree line, and above everything a sky so vast and gray and real that I dropped to one knee, not from weakness, but from the sheer perceptual shock of open space. After 64 days of ceilings, Martine made a sound, not a word, just an exhalation, the kind of breath you release when you surface from deep water. Cal stood in the doorway and tilted his face upward and let the cold air touch his skin, and I watched him become something closer to the man he'd been before. Not fully. You don't recover from 60 days underground in a breath. But the trajectory changed. The vector pointed upward. Birdie walked to the window and looked out at the world with the same fixed intensity she'd applied to everything underground. And then she said, "We should move." Standing still is a decision. She was right. We moved. The route took 4 days instead of Jean's estimated 2. Not because of the infected. We encountered them, yes, but less densely than we'd feared. The cold had slowed them. December in the Pacific Northwest is a relentless, wet, gray cold, and whatever mechanism drove the infected was affected by temperature. They moved through the forest in 1s and 2s, stiff, diminished, more like obstacles than predators. We heard them before we saw them, and we adjusted course, giving wide berths, staying in the tree cover that Jean's route prioritized. What slowed us was ourselves. 64 days underground had cost us physically in ways that the bunker's walking lap exercise regimen couldn't compensate for. Our muscles fatigued quickly on uneven terrain. Our eyes, adapted to artificial light, struggled with depth perception under overcast skies. Martine's knees swelled on the first day to the point where Cal fashioned walking sticks from fallen branches, and she used them without complaint, but at a pace that halved our progress. We slept in shifts in a barn the first night, a state park maintenance shed the second, an overturned delivery truck the third. Each shelter provisional, each departure at dawn. Each day, a recalibration of how far we could push bodies that had forgotten what distance felt like. Gene navigated with the radio and the charts, and twice he picked up the long view frequency and confirmed the base was active. The convoys were running. The intake was ongoing. The infected we saw were alone or in pairs, drifting through the landscape with the aimless persistence of leaf litter in a slow current. One stood in a creek bed, waist-deep in water, motionless, and we passed within 30 feet of it without it registering our presence. Another emerged from a barn we'd considered sheltering in, and Cal raised the hatchet, and the thing looked at him, looked through, and walked past, oriented towards some signal we couldn't detect. The cold had made them less reactive, but no less wrong. Their bodies still moved with that fundamental misalignment, joints bending on axes that human physiology didn't support, and seeing them in daylight, in open air, after months of only imagining them, was both more and less terrible than I'd expected. More because they were real. Less because the real is always smaller than what the mind constructs in darkness. On the morning of day 68, we crested a hill above the Columbia River and saw Longview. It was real. The base was real. A compound built around the Longview Civic Center, surrounded by concrete barriers and military vehicles, with visible personnel on the perimeter and visible civilians moving inside the compound, and a flag. An American flag, incongruously normal, hanging from a makeshift pole above the gate. Birdie was the one standing next to me on that hill. She looked at the compound, and then she looked at me and she said, "Nora, that's your name. Nora Vasquez. You measure things. You're good at it." I didn't understand at first, then I did. She was anchoring me, the way I'd anchored myself in the bunker, reciting facts, maintaining identity through repetition. She'd watched me do it for weeks, and she'd learned it, and now she was giving it back. Because the journey from underground to the surface was not just physical, it was ontological. We were returning to a world that contained other people, institutions, language, expectation, and the selves we'd constructed in isolation were going to be tested against a reality that hadn't agreed to our terms. I needed someone to remind me who I was. Birdie, who had never told us who she was, did that for me. I still don't know what to do with the generosity of it. We walked down the hill. Gene raised the radio and made contact. The gate opened. Soldiers met us. Real soldiers, with real procedures, with clipboards and medical checks, and questions that assumed we were people with histories and futures. 30 miles, 4 days, 100 days since October 9th. 100 days in concrete. And the hardest part wasn't the dark, or the silence, or the fear, or even Warren's suffocating certainty. The hardest part was the moment the gate closed behind us and someone handed me a cup of coffee and said, "Welcome, you're safe now." And I realized I didn't know if the person hearing those words was the same person who'd entered the bunker, or something the bunker had made, shaped by darkness the way water shapes limestone, slowly, invisibly, into a form that doesn't remember what it was before. I went back for Warren on day 112. A military escort, an armored vehicle, the route I'd walked in reverse. The community center was still standing. The blast door was still sealed. I knocked on it with a pipe wrench Gene lent me. The sound I made was the same sound that Gene had made on day 48, transmitted through steel and concrete, a human rhythm in a dead building. The door opened. Warren stood in the frame, thinner, older by more than 12 days, holding his notebook against his chest. "The base is real," I said. "Longview, military, civilians, medical, food. It's real, Warren." He looked past me at the soldiers, at the vehicle, at the gray December sky. He looked at it the way a man looks at a language he used to speak and is no longer sure he remembers. "I built this," he said. Not to me. To the corridor behind him. To the concrete. "You did. And it worked. And now it's done." He stood in that doorway for a long time. Then he picked up a bag he'd already packed, because Warren planned for every contingency, even the ones he resisted, and he walked up the stairs into the light, blinking, diminished, alive. We drove north. I watched the trees pass through the armored window, and I held my own name in my mouth like something fragile, testing its weight for cracks. Nora Vasquez, the woman who measures things, still here, still measuring, still not sure the instrument is calibrated right, but pointing it at the daylight anyway and writing down what it reads.